Hi, my name is Mia Page. I'm a young fashion designer and I'm making this video about a corset top that I made. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. It really means a lot to me. I studied abroad in Italy last semester and I was there from January until May. We had 3 projects over the course of the semester. For the final project, we did an experimental collection. So we made one garment. The collection that I did was inspired by water. I'll show some images of my mood board and some of the drawings that I did for the rest of the collection. But I made this look right here, and when I got back to America, I decided to make it a little bit more wearable by removing those black pieces and then just sewing up the seam where I seam ripped. And I would like to make a matching top version, so I went ahead and used the same pattern. I just made one small adjustment in the princess seam by taking it in about 1/8 of an inch. So here is the process of me making this corset top. Okay, so to get started here, I am just working on the facing for the top of the neckline. I had each individual panel as its own facing piece originally, and I think it'll just be better if I combine them all into one. So I just combined those pieces all together, and I'm just working on making a few adjustments to the pattern. The neckline was a little bit too high and pointy originally, so I did end up changing that when I made the dress, and I didn't fix it on the pattern. And then I'm just taping the pieces together so I can make sure to smooth out the neckline and make it match up for the facing. So yeah, I'm just continuing to smooth everything out and making sure that everything is matching up. All of the lines are still the same length, and that the neckline and the waistline are still a nice smooth line. Here I am after I decided that I wanted to retrace the entire upper facing to be one piece, and I needed to add on to the bottom a little bit, which is why I needed a whole new piece of paper. And I also needed to add the center back of the top to the facing. That way, when I was sewing on the loops to tie up the back, I could sandwich that between the outer bodice and the facing. And now I'm just tracing where the facing ends on the center back piece so I can make the lining. I made sure the facing was traced onto all of the regular pieces, and I also made sure that the facing piece was notched at all of the seams. I retraced all of the pieces minus the facing portion plus seam allowance to make the lining part for every piece of this top. I ironed my fabric and got it ready to cut all the pieces out, and then I laid down the pattern pieces, laid down a couple items to weigh it down a little bit, and then I just cut it all out with my rotary cutter. Then I went around and clipped the notches with my scissors. I did this for all of the pieces, and I ended up with 1 center front unfold, 2 side fronts, 2 side backs, and 2 center backs. Now I'm cutting out my facing out of the same fabric on fold. Don't forget to clip the notches. And now I'm ironing out this white fabric because this design has 2 white panels. On the left side while wearing, the side front and the side back are this white textured kind of fabric. Here are all of my shell pieces and my facing piece cut out. I cut out fusible interfacing for each piece, including the facing, and now I'm just laying out each piece, giving it a nice press, and then I'm going to iron the fusible interfacing on. a little easier to iron the interfacing on before you cut the piece out, but I had limited interfacing and this is a little bit of a weird piece. Here are all my pieces cut out, except for the lining, which I did off camera. I sewed the side seams first. Now I'm using a pressing ham to press all of my seams open, and most of my seams have some curve into it, so to make sure it lays nice and flat, I am just going to clip into the edges at a diagonal so it doesn't pull as much on the seam. Next, I sewed front princess seams. I wanted to add a black piece as a reference to the original dress, so I'm just measuring from where I want it to start to where I want it to end. I measured the width and then I clipped and ripped it along the whole length of the fabric, and it was pretty long, so this lasted a while. Don't mind my dull blade, but I just straightened up this edge and then I pinned it right sides together, and then I took it to my machine and sewed all along the edge of the fabric, folded over so I could turn it out into a tube. I ironed it out and then I measured out that length that I measured earlier, and I thought I was going to add one of these black panels onto the dress too, but I ended up just leaving it as is without the black pieces. So I only used one of these and I ironed it so that the seam was in the middle on the underneath piece so that it wouldn't be seen while wearing it. I seam ripped a spot on the princess seam and inserted the black piece onto that side opposite from the white side. I pinned it in, I sewed that, and then adjusted the other side. Now I'm cutting out all of my lining pieces, and I cut the center front on fold, and the other pieces I cut them on fold but not on the fold, so that there would be two pieces of each. All my lining pieces are cut out now. I sewed all those together, aligning the notches. Next, I sewed the lining to the facing along the top, and then I sewed it along the vertical seams by the center back. I used black bias tape as boning channels, and I really wanted it to turn out good, so I pinned it along the middle of my seam, and then I basted it with the longest stitch on my machine so that it would stay in place. And you can't really see it from the front. This is called stitching in the ditch, but you can see on the back where it's stitched right along the middle of that tape. And then I went in with my machine on a regular stitch length, and I sewed on either side of that seam using my presser foot as a guide, and I used my stitch width to move my needle position over. I'm really happy with how neat this came out and how even the lines are, so I repeated this on all of the seams. I used used spiral steel boning for the first time, and I had to cut it with wire cutters and pliers to press on the ends. I pinned all my loops in place and basted over it with my machine. I sandwiched the facing and lining piece with my shell, and then I pinned everything in place so that I could sew all the way around, leaving the bottom part open. I paired up the seams on the bodice with the notches on the facing, and this made it really easy to line up this super long neckline piece. I clipped my corners so they would turn out nice and sharp, and then I trimmed down the seam allowance along the side, and then I clipped along the entire neckline around all of those curves so the neckline can turn out nice and smooth. I tried this method of turning the seam allowance in on itself so the corner has a little bit more structure when you're turning it out, and I do think it helped pop my corner out a little bit more sharp. Next, I'll understitch the seam allowance towards the facing. That way it keeps the facing on the inside of the garment and keeps it from rolling out. It was getting a little bit bulky around the neckline, so after I understitched, I took my scissors and trimmed really close to that seam. Be careful not to cut through the neckline. Here's a better look at that steel boning, and here I am trying to get this cap that fell off on, and this was giving me a little bit of a struggle. I had to switch between pressing it horizontally tight against the edges and then flattening it out, and it kept on widening, so I had to switch back and forth, but eventually I got it, and I just made sure that all of the caps were tight on both ends for all of the boning pieces. I pushed all of the boning up into the channels so that there was at least half an inch below the boning channel for me to sew the bias binding onto the hem. Before I finish the hem, I need to sew a boning channel on either side of the center back to give some structure while lacing up the center back. It's ready for the hem now, so I just took some black bias binding and I folded in the edge so that it would be finished on either side, and I lined it up along the bottom, pinned it, and just really took my time to sew along the first crease of the bias binding. After I sewed the first row of stitching, I trimmed the corner, and then I just trimmed along the entire edge of the seam allowance. Then I took the iron and I ironed the bias binding completely inward so that you can't see it from the front. I took my time to iron well because I didn't want the bias binding to show from the front. I clipped it in place, and I had to be really careful when I was sewing. I decided to hand stitch this with a whip stitch because I didn't want it to be visible from the front. So now the top is done. so much for watching this video, and I really appreciate you making it until the end. If you would like to subscribe to see more videos from me, I will be putting out more content about my designs that I've made throughout college, before college, and stuff I'm going to be making in the future. So if you would like to see more from me, more designs, please subscribe and like this video.